The term was coined in 1938 by a surgeon at Boston Children's Hospital named Donald McCollum. He called it the Wringer arm. He was describing an injury pattern he had seen so many times that it needed its own name. A child's hand caught between the two rubber rollers of an electric Wringer washing machine, pulled in up to the shoulder before the machine could be stopped, the arm compressed and burned and stripped of skin from fingertip to armpit. Between 1937 and 1951, McCollum and his colleagues at Boston Children's treated 142 children with this injury. That was one hospital, in one city, over 14 years. Across the country, in every city with a hospital and a pediatric ward, surgeons were seeing the same thing. At one institution alone, 483 children under the age of 16 were hospitalized for Wringer arm injuries over a 20-year period. The injuries ranged from simple abrasions to loss of limbs. Most of the victims were under 5 years old. Most were injured at home, in their own kitchen or laundry room, standing beside a machine their mother was operating. The machine was a Wringer washer. For nearly a century, it sat in the homes of ordinary families, and it did to children's arms what factory machinery did to adult workers' hands. The difference was that nobody called it industrial equipment. They called it a washing machine. If you learn something from these deep dives into the machines that built and broke the industrial world, subscribing is the single best way to support the channel. The Wringer was not a washing machine in the modern sense. It was the extraction device, the part that removed water from wet laundry after washing. Before electric spin cycles existed, the only way to get water out of a soaked sheet or a heavy wool coat was to squeeze it out, and the only mechanical way to squeeze it was to pass it between two rollers pressed together under spring tension. The rollers were typically made of hard rubber, mounted in a cast iron or steel frame, and powered either by a hand crank or by an electric motor. On a hand-cranked Wringer, the rollers turned as fast as the operator could turn the handle. On an electric model, they turned continuously at a fixed speed, pulling whatever was fed between them through the gap at a rate of about 80 feet per minute. The wet laundry went in one side, passed between the rollers, and came out the other side compressed nearly flat, most of the water squeezed out and dripping into a tub below. A woman doing the household wash on a Monday, which was the universal wash day in America from the 1850s through the 1950s, would pass every item through the Wringer after each rinse, sometimes 3 or 4 times per item, hundreds of passes per wash day. Sheets, shirts, underwear, socks, tablecloths, towels, children's clothing, work clothes, everything went through the rollers. The machine had been around in one form or another since the 1840s. John E. Turnbull of St. John, New Brunswick, patented one of the first Wringer mechanisms in 1843. By the 1860s, hand-cranked Wringers manufactured by companies like the Metropolitan Washing Machine Company were being advertised across North America. The Canadian agriculturist described the device in 1861. Clothes were passed between two rollers covered with India rubber by turning a handle, and a large sheet could be passed through in 5 seconds. The force required was slight. The device saved women from the brutal labor of wringing heavy wet laundry by hand, a task that destroyed wrists and shoulders over years of weekly repetition. The Wringer was marketed as a liberation device, and in many ways it was. By the turn of the century, the hand-cranked Wringer was the most common piece of laundry equipment in American homes. By the 1930s, the electric Wringer washer had replaced it, combining a wash tub with a motorized Wringer mounted on top. Maytag, the dominant manufacturer, introduced its gyrator-style washer in 1922, and by 1927 had produced its first million machines. The company offered models that ran on either electricity or gasoline, the gasoline option designed for rural homes that had not yet been wired, which in the 1920s and the 1930s was the majority of American farms. The Maytag Model 92 had a 2-stroke gasoline engine mounted beneath the tub that powered both the agitator and the Wringer through a belt drive. The owner's manual advised keeping fingers away from the Wringer at all times. By 1940, 60% of the 25 million wired homes in the United States had an electric washing machine, and most of those machines had a power wringer mounted on top. Maytag alone would produce 11.7 million wringer washers before discontinuing the design in 1983, 76 years after the company began making them. These electric machines remained the standard household washing machine in the United States well into the 1950s. In many homes, especially in working-class and rural areas, the electric wringer washer remained in use through the 1960s and the 1970s, long after automatic washers with spin cycles had become available because wringer washers were cheaper, more durable, and used less water. A new wringer washer cost roughly half the price of an automatic, and it used about a third of the water because the same tub of water could be reused for multiple loads, with the cleanest clothes washed first and the dirtiest last. For families on tight budgets, the wringer washer was not a choice. It was the only machine they could afford. Wash day in a wringer washer household was a full day of labor. The woman, and it was almost always a woman, started early in the morning. She filled the tub with hot water, either heated on the stove and carried in buckets, or in later models fed through a hose connected to the house plumbing. She added soap, loaded the first batch of laundry, and ran the agitator until the clothes were clean. Then she lifted each item out of the soapy water with a wooden stick or by hand, fed it between the wringer rollers to squeeze out the wash water, and dropped it into a rinse tub. She agitated it again and fed it through the wringer a second time. Some items went through a second rinse with bluing added to whiten the fabric, then through the wringer a third time. Every item in the household went through this process. A family of 5 could generate enough laundry to keep a woman at the machine from breakfast until mid-afternoon, feeding wet cloth between the rollers hundreds of times, standing in a kitchen thick with steam and the smell of lye soap, the wringer turning continuously beside her, the children underfoot, because there was nobody else to watch them and the kitchen was where the family lived. The problem with the wringer was the NIP point. The two rollers converging on each other created a gap that would accept whatever was fed into it and pull it through with the combined force of the spring tension holding the rollers together and the torque of the motor turning them. The rollers could not distinguish between a wet sheet and a human hand. If a finger touched one of the rollers while the motor was running, the roller carried the finger into the nip point, the gap closed on it, and the hand followed, then the wrist, then the forearm. The arm was pulled between two rubber cylinders pressing together with enough force to flatten a folded wool blanket, and the arm was not a folded wool blanket. The rollers compressed the soft tissue, crushed the underlying structures, and continued pulling. The rubber surface of the rollers gripped the skin and created friction burns that stripped the epidermis from the arm in sheets. The compression created massive edema, hematomas, and in severe cases destroyed the blood supply to the tissue below the point of compression, leading to necrosis and gangrene. Fractures were less common than you would expect because the rollers tended to compress rather than break bone, but dislocations, nerve damage, and vascular injuries were standard. In the worst cases, the arm was pulled through to the shoulder and the child's body was dragged against the frame of the wringer with a force the child could not resist. The victims were overwhelmingly children. Not because children were operating the machine, but because children were standing next to it while their mothers used it. The wringer sat on top of the wash tub at a height of about 3 feet, exactly the reach height of a toddler or a young child standing beside the machine. The rollers turned continuously while the mother fed wet laundry into them. The child, curious, bored, or simply standing too close, touched the roller. Or the child reached for a piece of clothing being fed through. Or the child's hand brushed against the wet laundry as it entered the nip point and was carried in with it. One woman recounting the incident decades later described hearing a scream from the kitchen on a Sunday morning and running downstairs to find her 3-year-old daughter with her entire arm pulled into the wringer up to the shoulder. The machine's safety release had not triggered because the child's arm was too thin to activate the pressure threshold. The arm was into the shoulder before the roller stopped. The girl had a green stick fracture in 2 places. She recovered. Thousands of children did not recover as well. The turning rollers created 2 destructive forces simultaneously: friction and compression. The friction stripped skin from the arm in sheets, producing burns that ranged from mild abrasions to full-thickness skin loss that exposed the muscle and fascia beneath. The compression crushed the soft tissue flat, destroying the small blood vessels that feed the skin and creating massive subcutaneous hematomas. When the compression was severe or prolonged, the blood supply to the tissue below the point of injury was cut off entirely, and the tissue died. If a child pulled against the rollers, which every child did instinctively, the pulling created an avulsion effect that separated the skin from the underlying fat and muscle, stripping it from the arm like a glove being pulled inside out. The surgeons who treated these injuries developed specific protocols for wringer arm management that included elevation, pressure dressings from axilla to fingertip, and close observation for compartment syndrome, a condition in which the swelling inside the compressed tissue builds pressure until it cuts off circulation to the entire limb. In the worst cases, the arm could not be saved. In the 1940s and 1950s, it was not unusual to see people, especially children, with scarred and discolored arms from wringer injuries. Pediatric surgeons in that era treated wringer arm cases as a routine part of their practice. One Florida study documented 300 cases. A study at a single pediatric hospital reported 115 children treated in just 2 years. A Minnesota review called wringer injuries a persistent and predictable pediatric emergency. The medical literature of the mid-20th century contains dozens of papers on wringer arm management, all of them noting the same thing. The injuries were common, the victims were young, and the machine that caused them was in the home. The wringer manufacturers knew the machine was dangerous. Starting in the 1950s, they began adding safety release mechanisms, devices that would cause the rollers to spring apart if the pressure between them exceeded a certain threshold. The idea was that an arm entering the rollers would trigger the release before the arm was pulled all the way through. The releases worked sometimes. They did not work when the child was too small to trigger the pressure threshold. They did not work when the mechanism was worn or corroded. They did not work when the mother, panicking, tried to pull the child's arm out instead of activating the release, which pulled the arm further into the rollers and tightened the compression. The instinct to pull a trapped limb away from a machine is universal and almost always wrong. In a wringer, pulling backward against the direction of the rollers only increases the grip, the same physics that made the PTO shaft and the conveyor belt so lethal in industrial settings. The correct action was to reverse the rollers or trigger the release bar. Taking that correct action required a person in a state of panic to override the most powerful instinct the human body possesses and push forward or sideways instead of pulling back. The commercial mangle was far worse. In hotels, hospitals, and large-scale laundries, industrial mangles used heated rollers up to 6 feet wide, powered by steam or electricity, turning at higher speeds and under greater pressure than any household wringer. These machines pressed sheets, tablecloths, and uniforms flat and smooth in a single pass, a process that replaced hours of hand ironing. The rollers were hot, sometimes above 200 degrees Fahrenheit, because the heat helped smooth and dry the fabric at the same time. A hand caught in a commercial mangle was not only compressed, but burned. The combination of crushing force and thermal injury produced wounds that were devastating and frequently required amputation. The medical literature classified these separately from wringer injuries under the heading of mangle injuries, because the thermal component changed the injury pattern so dramatically that the two conditions required different treatment protocols. In a Wringer injury, the primary damage was mechanical: compression, friction, avulsion. In a mangle injury, the primary damage was thermal, compounded by mechanical. The rollers cooked the tissue while they crushed it, producing deep burns that destroyed the viability of the skin and underlying structures before the compression damage even had time to develop. Women who worked in commercial laundries in the 19th and early 20th centuries fed fabric into these machines by hand, hour after hour, standing within inches of rollers that would accept a hand as readily as a sheet. The commercial laundry was one of the largest employers of women in the Victorian era, and into the early 20th century. The work was hot, wet, exhausting, and dangerous. The women stood on stone or concrete floors in rooms thick with steam, feeding wet linen into mangles that hissed and rumbled, the heat from the rollers radiating outward in waves. The laundresses were almost exclusively working-class women, many of them immigrants, many of them supporting families on wages that barely covered rent. In Britain, the laundress occupied one of the lowest rungs of domestic service, considered physically strong but socially disreputable. An independent woman doing manual labor that polite society preferred not to think about. In the United States, commercial laundry work was heavily concentrated among black women and immigrant women, the same populations that were overrepresented in every dangerous occupation where the pay was low and the protections were non-existent. The injuries these women sustained were treated as an ordinary cost of the work, documented in the medical literature but not in the newspapers, not in the labor reform movements of the era, not in the public conscience. The textile mills had their reformers, the coal mines had their unions, the commercial laundries had women feeding hot rollers in silence. The Wringer washer was rendered obsolete by the automatic washing machine, which replaced the mechanical wringer with a perforated drum that spun at high speed to extract water by centrifugal force. No rollers, no nip point, no gap for a hand to enter. General Electric introduced the first fully automatic washer in 1947. By the late 1950s, automatic machines were outselling Wringer washers. By the 1970s, Wringer washers had largely disappeared from American homes, though they persisted in some rural areas and developing countries well into the 1980s and beyond. Maytag, which had built its entire company on the Wringer washer, discontinued production in late 1983. By that point, the company had manufactured 11.7 million units over 76 years, and industry sales had been declining steadily since 1948. The Wringer washer did not end because of regulation or litigation or public outcry over the injuries it caused. It ended because automatic washers were more convenient, and the volume of Wringer sales was too low to justify the production line. The phrase survived the machine. To put someone through the wringer is still an expression in American English, meaning to subject them to a harsh and exhausting ordeal. Most people who use the phrase have no idea it refers to a specific machine that sat in their grandmother's kitchen and pulled their mother's generation through it by the arm. The Consumer Product Safety Commission reported over 19,000 washing machine-related injuries between 1993 and 2000. But by then, the majority involved automatic machines, and the injury patterns were different, less severe, less consistent, and less exclusively focused on children's arms. The era of the Wringer arm was over, not because anyone banned the machine or regulated it out of existence, but because a better machine replaced it. The Wringer did not die because it was dangerous. It died because the spin cycle was more convenient. The danger was never the reason it was removed from the American home. The danger was never enough. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, subscribe. There are more machines like this one, and every one of them left a body count the world forgot.